gratuitous meeting. Simon represents for me the best of what our current dialogue with the camera has to offer. I would advise all of you to look at his website if you haven't. Go to his show at Bonnie Ben Ruby's and get a little more about his history. The reason I mentioned the website is because it's not just a place, here are my pictures, gang. Here's some big, beautiful, wonderful pictures. It's a place to follow into those pictures, into inquiry about the subject they are about the underlying subjects and histories from which they emanate, and a place that combines history, tech, psychology, philosophy, and even archaeology with very contemporary images. On top of it, Simon is a wonderful image maker, a colorist, a documentarian, a journalist, a conceptualist, an investigator, and a humanitarian, most important, the last term. He's interested in why we battle, why we war, what happened, its side effects, its ancillary effects, its unseen effects, and its remedies. So, with no further ado, I am turning this lecture to Simon. And once again, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Al. There's a couple of spaces here and here. I think anyone's standing at the back. I'm going to use this accent. Is that okay? Anyone need a song for Channel 3? So I'm going to talk about 3/4 hour or so. In order to keep you entertained, and I have to say, some of this lecture dips into history. Okay, so in order to keep you awake, at the very end of this lecture, there's a competition. And maybe be a prize, but only if you're really good, okay? Could you put on a picture, please? My early work is okay. All right, well, I went to Afghanistan in 2001, and I made these pictures that completely changed my reputation, completely changed how people thought about me, it changed my finances, changed me from being very much a photojournalist into someone who works in the art market, and actually made me solvent for the first time in my life. I would defy you to meet anybody who's been to Afghanistan who's not smitten by a certain Afghanistanitis, that there is something about that place, this city that has this corona of these snow-top mountains that is completely beguiling, and you fall in love a little bit with it, and with these beautiful, kind people that are so sweet. So I always felt that I was a little bit beholden. I'm not a religious person, quite the opposite, but I do subscribe to an idea of witness, the idea that you should honestly pay your debts for the things that you're owed in this world. And I feel like I owe Afghanistan. So I always intended that I would return there at some point and try and do something, because, unbeknownst to myself, in 2001 I was photographing in this kind of golden early morning light, and it's a reference to the idea of romantic painting in Claude Lorraine and Catherine Friedrich and Nicolas Poussin. But all of those painters, that golden light is a question mark. It's saying, is this the dawn of a great civilization, or is this the twilight of the civilization's final days? So for me, that golden light was a way of saying, where is this place in its imperial history? As W.B. Yeats wrote, kingdoms rising, kingdoms falling, bowing nations, plumed wars, captured in an hour of dreaming, cooking chestnuts on the bars. So the idea of this kind of great sweep of empire, these great cycles of empire sweeping through this place, and the Americans are just the latest in a long series of 2,500 years of invaders, each one of them barbarians that devastated this beautiful war-torn country. So without me really trying to, in some ways, this picture I made in 2001 actually quite redemptive, because I thought the war was over. I thought this place would kind of brush itself down and tidy itself up and begin again somehow, and that there would be a new world dawning. I was a bit wrong about that, wasn't I? So that kind of golden light was part of that. So to see this thing on the TV news just crushed and hammered time and time again, every time I switch on the news, more of my taxpayers' money, my country's army are in this country slaughtering this thing, and your country too. To see that on the TV news is just heartbreaking. So I always wanted to go back to the place and produce a second piece of work. Somehow there was a reply to that. I couldn't really think about how to go back. If I was to go back in 2011, then it would be what I call a Spot the Dog story. You know that children's book, Spot the Dog? And all it would be, in 2001 it was a crater, in 2011 it's a pizza hut. And after you've seen three of them, you'd be as bored as I would be. And also, more importantly, it was the extremely false idea of what I believe is the progress that's taken place in that country. But there has been some progress here and there. On the contrary, there's been a lot of zero progress, and there's been some extremely bizarre things that happened with all that money that's poured into the place. So the idea of doing a sort of then and now thing, not only is it sort of dreary, and not only is it the wrong politics, but it's also rather narcissistic and self-referential, because it's just about my stuff now and my stuff 2001. Can you flick on another picture or something? So you could do a little kind of project with me, and it would be moderately interesting, but not interesting enough for you. So this is a picture from 2001. Travis? Travis?
Yes.
Thank you. And that's what it looks like. That's what it looks like now. It's the top half of my story. That must look quite good.
If you start over to that side again on the white.
No. I do need to see the
There you
That's great. You know, it's kind of interesting that it hasn't really changed at all. Next one. This is a 2001. Next one. Not the scrap has really changed. And the next one takes a bit of looking actually. The only thing you can map as being the same is the shape of the top of the mountain range, which is the way I worked out where I was using Google Images, using Google Earth. You can go around Google Earth, work out the mountain range shape, and then work your way backwards. You're not wrong about it. Silence, yes. You know you can flip over the map, yeah? Yes. So the only thing can you just go back one? You have to look at that door lintel there. Right. Next one. That's that. And even the road level's been moved up because they've rebuilt this area using trucks, so they had to rebuild the road and canalize the stream and stuff. But the only thing that really is in place is that wall and that door. So you could do a project about that, but I think it would be there. Next one, please. Last year I was asked by Tate Modern Gallery in the UK if I would consider doing some teaching in Afghanistan. And I already had my beady eye on doing a project there, which I'll explain to you in a second. I'm not a teacher, but I thought this would be interesting to do. And I like the idea of giving something back by doing some training with 6 Afghan journalists. And although they didn't know it, they were in a job interview. So the best one that was there, I gave him my fee and said, if I come back and do my project, will you be my driver, translator, fixer, security guard, alarm clock, everything. And I started working with this young man called Fardin Moizi, who's a really great old school photojournalist. And yesterday he sent me those superb photographs of a dead Taliban in the back of a pickup truck after this gunfight in August. And Fardin has been a photographer since he was 7. He was allowed by the Taliban to take ID card pictures outside the Ministry of Interior, and he managed to keep some of the negatives from that period. And he's got 4 brothers that are all photographers, and his father was a photographer too. His father was a photographer to the Royal Court in Afghanistan through the 60s and 70s when there was still a king. And when the Taliban found out about this, when they came to power, they lifted his father and they tortured him for 11 months. And finally they came to the house to get all of the negatives and prints to prove that he had connections with the old regime. And his mother burned everything. She burned every neg and every print from that time. She saved his life, but they had to destroy the thing. Fardin was able to hide some of the pictures, the negatives that he shot, of things people who were turning up for ID cards. And one day he did a kind of composite of all the next picture. But he's a really great photojournalist, and he's a charmer, a silvery-tongued liar, a sweetheart, a man with 3,000 phone numbers in his cell phone. He knows everybody, but someone very, very brave and very prepared to get to the thick of it. And a perfect fixer, because he wasn't going to go all wobbly when it wasn't wobbly time, but he was going to say, we need to go, we need to go. Next picture. This is the kind of thing he does. He works in the United Nations he shoots their picture of the day for the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, which is called UNIMA, and he shoots their daily life events and the rest of it. This is a tracker like this. Next picture. But he also does a lot of really tough arguments as well. This is the attack on the Afghan parliament. Next picture. So this was like working with, it was like employing a young Ouija to come and work for him. It was like this kind of charming, dodgy, bit of a shyster, but a gambler, and a smoother maneuver and a negotiator through what is an extremely awkward city to negotiate with. And the plan that I had in mind was 12 weeks worth of street photography in Kabul. And Kabul is not a good place to do street photography. So I needed some serious help. Now, anybody that's thinking, one of the real problems I have with this current wave of, particularly, this is very much a lecture about race, right? But one of the problems that I have with a lot of these white photographers that are turning the camera onto Africa is they don't have any kind of notion of history standing behind it. And it seems to me that certainly if you're English and you start photographing someone like Afghanistan, you need to know something about what happened in that country in its imperial history. And it may be that you talk to an American soldier or a British soldier, and that's about history. They know absolutely nothing about Britain's imperial history. I'll tell you who doesn't know: Afghans. They know all of this. They know every damn thing. They know the names of the battles. They know the names of their resistance fighters. They know who committed the atrocities. They know all of these things, and they name their kids after the commanders that were their commanders that were in these battles. So this kind of history is completely alive to them, although it's utterly inert and dead to us. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to teach you a little bit of history today, which is extremely boring, but I'll try and make it happen. What interests me is that I would say that the current war in Afghanistan is the fourth Anglo-Afghan war. It's the fourth attempt to subjugate this country. And each one of these wars is all following exactly the same routine. And the first Anglo-Afghan war is at the sort of early juvenile period of the British Empire. The first Anglo-Afghan war takes place in 1838. And it's only interesting because it ended in an absolute disaster for the British. It ended with the absolute total destruction of the British army that was sent in there. The army was sent in there, false intelligence about how welcome would be, false intelligence about how easy it would be to resupply our troops, false intelligence about how popular the fellow that we gambled all our money on was going to be when we got to Afghanistan. Is this familiar? And an army of 16,000 soldiers, the army of the Indus, was sent into Afghanistan with 10,000 women and children camp followers. And for a couple of years they were welcomed and they played polo and had mass balls and the rest of it. Little by little it started to fall apart. And in the winter of 1841, they attempted a fighting retreat through the Khod Kabul, one of the passes between Kabul and what is now Pakistan. And in the course of 3 days and 3 nights, every single person in that army was butchered by the Afghans that were in the nation. Every single one, 26,000 people was killed. This represented an absolute stop in the tracks for the British Empire. Until that moment, no European army had been so completely devastated by a Third World Army, the Third World War at that time. In fact, apart from possibly the American Revolution, the British Army never really been halted in its steps anyway. So the reason why the reason why that's interesting is because it gave a green light to a whole series of resistance movements around the world, really. This idea that these Europeans could actually be stopped. So it gave the green light to the Boxer Rebellion in China, to the Zulu Wars in South Africa, and to the one that really put the focus on the British, the Indian Mutiny in India in 1857. So the reason why the second Anglo-Afghan War happened is because the first Anglo-Afghan War happened. And it had to be punished, and it had to be repaired, and the stain had to be erased. That these, just as America is now this kind of global policeman, that Britain had to police this thing and had to show these people that they couldn't rise up and fight back. Next slide, please. So the second Anglo-Afghan War was kind of pushed into in 1878, by which time we had the dawn of photography. And the British Empire is this kind of global expanding thing, but this is the real daddy of them all. British India is the kind of diamond in the crown of the India Empire. And the real kind of problem there is this top left-hand corner, because that's where Imperial India is growing. And the real crisis point of this is next slide. Is that the Russian Empire is also growing at this time, and it's growing southwards. And Afghanistan is being squeezed between these two growing empires. Britain going this way, Afghanistan this way, and Afghanistan is the space between these two things. The Russian Empire is trying to get warm water ports on the south. All the rest of their ports freeze up in the winter. They need to have a warm water port, and then they can be a truly global empire and take on British. So that everything must be done to stop the Russian Empire expanding. So this borderland here becomes really crucial. Next slide. This is a cartoon from Punch magazine from this time. But this is the Russian emir between the Afghan emir between the Russian bear and the British lion, saving from my friend. Someone's going to have them for lunch. Next slide, please. And this, I just found these pictures last week in a collection in California. It's fantastic pictures of the British looking leaders. Rather lovely badminton parade at some kind of country club in the hills. I like this, Joseph. It looks like shaking it.
So this is the period in which the British are extremely confident and extremely in control of Imperial India, and a period in which photography has become quite an important tool in depicting India, and more than that too, actually. And into this, this is the kind of milieu which this photographer, John Burke, that I talked to you about, steps into. He's a photographer in this place. He's not a photographer in the Imperial heartland, which is at this time is Calcutta, the Empire's rule from Calcutta. But he is a frontiersman. He lives in the town of Maree, which is like one of these country hill stations where the weather is cool in the summertime, and also the city of Peshawar. So both of those are now in Pakistan. This is right on the borderlands of Imperial India, surrounded on three sides by unconquered tribal lands, and garrisoned by frontiers and soldiers, these sort of special forces before special soldiers. Soldiers that wore their own uniforms, made their own rules, and were continually fighting border flare-ups. Next slide, please. I like the slightly kind of wobbling on the face on the elephant. That's a wonderful tiger picture. Next picture. And also, this is the context of this is this kind of great patriotic upswelling of like English feeling at home, a fever at home about the empire. Who, you know, the greatest troubadour of the empire is Rudyard Kipling. When you're wounded and left on Afghanistan's plains, and the women come out to cut up what remains, just roll on your rifle and blow out your brains and go to your gold like a soldier. This is the kind of cosmos that British schoolboys were living in. To be honest, this is something I was learning when I was at school too, and Henry Newbolt and the rest of it. And you have to remember that the main way that what was happening in the empire was channeled into the mind of the ordinary person in England was not via newspapers or TV or the internet. I think it may have been before the internet. But was not even by the illustrated newspapers, which were popular but not that popular. But the main way that people knew what was going on in the empire and they pictured the empire was via things like music hall songs, popular cod poetry, and history paintings, in particular these very large history paintings. Next picture. Of which this is a really great example. In its day, this was one of the most, it was a kind of rock star of a painting, one of the most famous paintings in Britain in the 1870s and 80s. And Lady Elizabeth Butler had an incredibly glamorous life. She married very well, she was very well connected, and made this tremendous, sensational series of paintings that were the cause of all the gossip in London. And she came within a gnat's whisker of being the first woman to be elected to a member of the Royal Academy. When I said that the entire British Army was exterminated in 1841, in actual fact there was famously one survivor of that incident, a man called Dr. William Brighton, who in the court Kabul in the cold, he took a copy of Blackwood's magazine and stuffed it inside his hat to keep his head warm. He was hit across the head with a sword and the blow went into the magazine. On this limp and knackered out old horse, he managed to limp into the fortress. This British soldier is coming from the fortress. He managed to limp into the thing, and then fabulously, the horse died. And he is the only survivor of this entire thing, and the painting is called The Remnants of an Army. And it's very arch, and it's very political, and it's rather sardonic. That in 1879, when the war drums are really beating for this new war in Afghanistan, Elizabeth Butler produces this painting to say, this is what happened last time. I have to say, I found this painting in the archives of Tate Gallery in the UK. It has been out of the archives since 1949, so you can go from super popular to never heard of it ever again. Pretty quickly. Actually, when I say that there was only one survivor of the British Army, there was actually about 20 ground survivors of this devastation, and they don't appear in any kind of paintings or records at all. This is a lecture about race in the British Army. When you see this painting, the first thing that strikes you about this painting is it's 14 foot across. And the reason it's 14 foot across is it's meant to be seen by crowds of people at the same time, and it was. It was seen by 40,000 people at the Royal Academy. Then it went into a tent on Highbury Fields and was seen by another 30,000 at sixpence each. And then it went to Liverpool, then it went to Norwich, then it went to Birmingham, to Bristol. These paintings were incredibly famous that day. And one of the key formers of how the ordinary person in the Imperial Metropolitan Centre thought about what was happening thousands of miles away. Next slide, please. This is Steve Bell, who is the sort of the great satirical cartoonist of the Guardian newspaper. This is Tony Blair sending the British troops back into Afghanistan in 2006. Chin-up managing doing it for the 21st century. Looks at the corpses of vocals. A man who really knows his history of painting. Next picture, please. I'm a trustee of the museum in Bradford, the National Media Museum in Bradford, and I'm an Afghanistan geek, and one of the librarians in Afghanistan geek. But this book is virtually uncatalogued. never been photographed until I found it. And it's rather obscure. And even people who know a lot about Victorian photography in India don't really know very much about John Burke. And I was at a meeting at the gallery, at the museum, and he went, "Psst, come and see this book. It's brilliant." And he showed me this album, and it's absolutely astonishingly good. And my shtick is that John Burke is the greatest war photographer you've never heard of. The greatest war photographer you've never heard of. The greatest war photographer you've never heard of. Two claims. And the reason why both of those things are true, how they are true, I think the reasons why they're true is actually really interesting. I'll tell you something about it. So I was shown this album. Next slide, please. Sorry, next one. This the page is all illustrated like this. And John Burke is, there's almost nothing is known about it. Almost nothing is known about it. There's only one book written about it, and not even by a photo story. The only book that's written by John Burke was written by a guy who writes apps for iPhones, who's just fell in love with the pictures like I did. It's a great book. So Burke is a country boy. He's like an Irishman. He's from County Wicklow, and his father, sometime after the Irish famine, joins the British Army. Was he forced to? Was there nothing else? Was it this or face starvation? There's no mention of any of the family. Did they die at that time? He joins the British Army and is sent straight out to India, not via England, straight to India, joins the Royal Artillery. And young John, both called John, young John is given a job as an apothecary, and he learns chemical grinding skills as an apothecary for the British Army. Like so many of these people, these young men that arrived in the Empire, his father succumbed in about 2 years to disease and died. And John is left at possibly 12, maybe 14 years old, is an orphan. But he's taken under the wings of another Irish Catholic called William Baker, who is quite well known in the history of Indian photography. And William Baker is quite a successful photographer, and he takes in young John because he has chemical skills, grinding skills, and he needs an apprentice that can prepare the albumen and the silver nitrates for the coating of the paintings for his prints. So John is taken in by this thing. And this is where we first get to see something about John as this person who continually remakes himself, somebody who remakes himself in a bid to escape these lowly roots that he's from, this kind of Irish Catholic country boy from rural Ireland. Within about 3 years of him arriving in the company, he marries William Baker's sister. About 2 years after that, it says over the door, William Baker and John Burke are photographers. About 3 years later, it says, John Burke, formerly of William Baker and John Burke, photographers. When he goes to Afghanistan, it just says, John Burke, photographer. And when he comes back from Afghanistan and he's at the height of his fame, he changes his shtick to John Burke, artiste photographer. And he's probably one of the first photographers in the world to do that, or certainly riding a wave of photography at that time to change their thing. And he ends the sort of great apogee of his career is in 1885. He is presented at a private reception of the Viceroy Hall of India, and there's no record of any other tradesman being allowed into something that was such a snobbish, elevated social occasion as that. So there's this unbelievably meteoric rise, each time a step up, each time leaving behind these roots that he was obviously rather ashamed about, each one of them a move up and up and up. In 1881, the lady that he married dies. Did she die of a disease that he brought back from Afghanistan? She certainly died of typhoid and cholera. Those were the diseases that were coming back from her. Did John kill her? Did he bring the disease back from Afghanistan? I don't know. But 2 years later, he makes a very smart move. He marries this very beautiful bourgeois lady whose father is chairman of the Chamber of Commerce, a big property owner, investor in industry, and John moves up a step, a reinventor himself, a self-inventor himself. And it's interesting in the history of photography how many of these people you find are reinventors. I would say something like Robert Capra is a great example of someone who completely reinvented himself to escape what the lowly origins were came from. Next slide. Right, keep your eye on this one because this is the only picture that we have of John Burke. So all of the things that I've tried to find out about him has been an absolute ghost. There's nothing known about him, almost nothing known at all about him. It's almost like he refuses to speak. So the last 2 years has been an attempt to try and persuade this dead man to speak to me about what he did, how he worked, how scared did he feel when he made his pictures, how did he make a living, what did he think, why was he working the way he was. All of this has been an investigation to try and pull this man out of the ashes. Because in 35 years as a working photographer, there's not a single picture of him. There's no photograph of John Burke in existence. And there's only 2 drawings of him work. This one and next one. This one. I mean, both of them
You can't see
You
his
can't
face.
see his face. There's no letters, there's no diaries, there's no evidence of his business. Within 2 years of his death, his entire business has disappeared without trace. Every single negative is lost. And one of the reasons why he's the greatest photographer you've never heard of is because he only produces albums of his work. He didn't produce books. Books go off on their own and they travel around the world and they sit in libraries and people discover it. But for John Burke's work, I read out and I showed you, it's an album. You would go into a shop, choose the 100 that you wanted, and there would be original prints would be glued in the albums. So unless you then bought one of those and brought it home from India and seen the tracks, it never would have existed in the world. And so my calculations, there's only 14 of that. They're as rare as hen's teeth. There's about 14, maybe 15 of them in the world. There's 2 in the US. There's one in the Library of Congress and there's one in the Getty. The Queen's got 2, British Library's got 3. So after his death, he completely disappears off things. Although in his day, he's one of the most celebrated photographers in the empire. As soon as he dies, he just completely disappears. And you get this sense of that maybe his business and his reputation is completely propelled up by this whirlwind of a man, this self-reinventor, this charming scoundrel of a man that he is. Next picture. This is his work, and I think his work is just sensational. In this kind of like super confidence that this man is, he writes to the British Army for a commission as an official photographer to go to Afghanistan, to be the first ever photographer to photograph Afghanistan. This is one of the first ever pictures that is made of Kabul. He writes to the British Army, and he's so confident he's going to get a gig, he leaves with all of his stuff. 2 weeks behind, a letter follows along saying, "No thanks, mate, we don't like your sort, because he's an Irishman, he's a Catholic, he's a traitor." And you have to remember that those racial hierarchies inside the British Empire are even more strictly adhered to than they are back in Norfolk. And the Irish Catholics wouldn't have even been allowed to live at the centre of the British encampments. They would have lived at the peripheries of them, close to those very anglicised Indians. But that blocking of him, that refusal to give him an official commission, is actually his unblocking. Because now he's free to photograph anything he wants to. And it's the flowering of him as a photographer. And suddenly he turns his camera on anything. There's nothing he won't photograph. And the thing is, he's really good at everything. Right, next one. So he's a great landscape photographer. Next one. Sorry, go back a bit. Really great pictures of these vistas of military encampments. I love these 3 chaps. Next picture. He photographs historical monuments in the centre of Kabul. This is the Nadir Shah Mausoleum, which now looks like this again, actually. It's been restored. Next one, please. Street scenes. This is Jalalabad. This is one of the first ever pictures made in Afghanistan in less than 1 day. It's actually 1878. Next picture, please. And wonderfully informal pictures of British soldiers. You've got to remember these pictures completely defy all the conventions of this time. Look at the informality of this. The reason why it's informal is because they live in this little dog-shit town right on the end of the empire, some flea-blown, dusty town. He knows these soldiers. He knows their wives and their kids. He photographs their medal parades, their cricket team events. He knows them personally. So he's not going to line them up like, serried ranks. On the contrary, he's going to kind of flick them up through the rocks. It's a really wonderfully informal picture for his time. Next picture, please. He photographs news events, the day that a horse column leaves the military base to wipe out the final Afghan resistance to the British invasion. Look at this picture. This is a sort of 6, 7, 8 second exposure. There must be about 400 people standing stationary for John Burke to take this picture. These horses. And right at the front, General Roberts. Next picture, please. And he photographs these wonderful archaeological sites, which have all disappeared. This is 1st century Buddhist sites near Jalalabad. So in all of these genres, he's really, really good. And that's very interesting that he should be so good. It's the reason why he's a great photographer. It's because there's nothing he won't photograph. So what we have is an incredibly complete record of a colonial encounter. The first colonial encounter between 2 groups recorded photographically. And it's incredibly complete. So if you compare this to photography that's produced in the South Pacific or in New Zealand, a lot of that photography is beach photography, because the beach was the only place where those 2 sides felt safe to meet each other. And so all of those treaty negotiations or the murder of Captain Cook in Hawaii all took place on the beach, because the beach was this interface. The English wouldn't go into the woods, and the locals wouldn't come out of the woods into the sea because of the warship. Next picture. So if you compare John Burke to someone like Roger Fenton was sent to the Crimea much earlier, But he was sent to the Crimea with a specific task in mind. The Times newspaper of London was saying that British soldiers were dying because they weren't fed properly and they weren't housed properly. And he was sent there to counter propaganda. And so when he photographs incredibly small range of pictures. Really, apart from that one with the cannonballs that do that, he photographs lots of big encampment pictures and lots of pictures like this. And the main thing about this is these blokes are standing outside the cookhouse. Right? They are well fed and they are well dressed. Next picture. This is the kind of thing he does, right? It's just counter propaganda. He's just there to record the idea that the soldiers are well dressed, they're well fed. And the purpose of all those encampment pictures, all those bell tents disappearing off each other, is to say, look how clean and new the bell tents are. Right? Everybody's got a tent, no one's sleeping out in the cookhouse. And so, whilst Fenton is a great photographer, the record is incredibly narrow. It's a very narrow kind of photography that he shoots ad nauseum. Next picture. Never let this man be your daughters. Swine and bounder. Now, if you compare John Burke to if anyone's got any questions, just stick your hand up and stuff, because I am making this up as we go along. To compare to all the other photographers of this time, what's really interesting about John Burke is that there is a humanity in his photographs which you just do not see in imperial photography. Now, I was born in Lagos in Nigeria. Am I going fast enough? I was born in Lagos in Nigeria, and the photography that comes out of certainly West Africa in the 1870s and 80s is brutally racist and hierarchical. And the photography observes really clear laws of hierarchy. So I would put to you that a little green man could come out of a spaceship and tell you exactly who's in charge in this picture and who cleans his shoes. Right? That the idea of hierarchy in the imperial photography is absolutely apparent here. Next picture. This is a much later era, it's the 1930s, but that idea of this kind of layeredness, who is the master and who is servant, is absolutely apparent in this kind of photography. And all the work that comes out of Empire is in this kind of style. Next picture. Some kind of imperial pedicure. And the next picture? Yes, marvelous. Family outing. So this idea of this kind of layerness is something which is absolutely ruthlessly enforced in all of the imperial photography, and I find that I can't look at anything. Because you have to see that when these pictures are seen inside the empire, it's a photograph of a way of life, it's a documentary of a way of life. But when these pictures are seen inside the imperial heartland, back in England, what an English audience looks at these pictures and sees is this is not just how empire looks, this is a justification for empire. This is the reason why we have to be there. Because of their lower status, we have to be there to elevate them, to Christianize them, to civilize them. If we weren't there, they'd be living in China. So not only are these pictures a record of how empire looks, but they actually become a tool in the creation and the enforcement of empire. And that's why I find these pictures so horrible to look at, because they're actually a tool of creating racial superiority and hierarchy, and enforcing that in the mind of the imperial heartland who would be paid for it. Next picture. And one of the really beautiful things about John Burke's time in Afghanistan is that you have a kind of perfect anthropological experiment, because another photographer arrives about 6 months later, goes to Kandahar and shoots almost exactly the same pictures. But my God, are they awful. Much, much worse. So this man is Dr. Benjamin Simpson. And Benjamin Simpson is a much more accurate mirror of empire's values. Benjamin Simpson he ends up as Surgeon General of India, so a very high position for him. But he's somebody who goes to school in England, he goes to the academy in England, he learns how to be a photographer, he looks at art in England, and then he moves to India, and he moves to the capital of India, Calcutta, where all the action is. And it's a much more accurate mirror of those values of superiority and arrogance, which is what is the motor that drives the British Empire on. And so when Simpson arrives in Kandahar, he's a good photographer technically, but he photographs what the British audience wants to see, which is these monsters, these swine who signed those deals to say that they would give safe passage to our army in 1841 and then slit their throats during the night time, 27,000 of them. We want to see these people as beaten and crushed and subjugated. And so this is how he photographs them. Look at his faces, look at this kind of miserable, downcast effect on the photography. This is how the British audience wanted to see Afghans, as kind of poor, impoverished, and crushed. Next picture. And this looks like some psychiatric hospital. commit suicide or something. But look at these faces and these gestures. Absolutely crushed and despondent, which is what a British audience wanted to see, and that's why Benjamin Simpson photographs that. Next picture. And when he photographs the Englishmen with Afghans, he photographs the Afghans standing up, the Englishman sitting down, and the dog, which I suspect is an English dog, is also sitting. Next picture. And I found this last week. It's a portrait of Benjamin Simpson. What a disgrace of a picture. Imagine being photographed like this. It's actually a self-portrait of him. It's shot later when he was on the South Pacific somewhere. But what an appalling picture to be photographed like that. It says something about the mind of the planet. Next picture. This is John Burke. Now, I put it to you. These people look subjugated. These people look crushed. These people look like the crushed victims of Britain's imperialism. I said the guy in the centre was downright saucy. And look how they're dressed. Maharaja. Right? This guy on the left-hand side, this guy here. Does he look like he's defeated? It's almost like John Burke wasn't there the day when they taught him about racial superiority. It's like that thing from South Pacific where they say you've got to be taught to hate all the people your relatives hate, you've got to be careful taught. It's almost like he doesn't know. Why is his photography so good? Because in the British Empire, he occupied a peripheral position. He knows that the British look right down their nose at him too. So he's not going to turn his camera on the British and photograph them as these kind of saintly gods that have come down from heaven to Christianize the world. On the contrary, he's going to cast his eye in a slightly arch way towards them. And when he sees the Afghans, what he sees is a culture which is, in many ways, an equivalent of the UK. So when he does a portrait like this one, I think this portrait is called something like 6 Surgeons of Kabul. Surgeons, they've got medicine. We thought they were tribal, nothings. They've got medicine. He does a picture called 9 Cavalry Policemen. But London only just had a police force in 1870. Kabul's got a police force. It's that kind of place. And suddenly this is a real meeting of kind of equals. Instead of it being a photography of like dominance and subjugation, on the contrary, what he's saying is Afghan society is pretty civilized. It has police forces and astronomers and scientists and surgeons and all those kind of things. And that's what he photographs. That's what he turns out. Next picture. I mean, downright naughty. And I think one of the things also is that John Burke makes arrangements with people to have photographs. This is very interesting to do with the relationship between the photographer and the sitter. Because in those Benjamin Simpson pictures, I think the way he makes pictures is he gets a couple of policemen and he goes in the market and he goes, you, there, photograph. And they go, and that's why they look the way they do. And they don't know what's going on, but there's a man with a big stick telling them what to do. And that's why that look is in their eyes. Whereas Burke, a lot of the pictures, you can see that he's built a little studio. In fact, there's a crack in the wall behind it. And you can see that he's using the same place. So he's not going out in the market and driving people into the photograph. On the contrary, he's saying, could you come back on Tuesday and I'll take a picture? So what you do is 2 things. First of all, you don't get your picture taken, you don't come back. And secondly, when you come back, put on your best stuff. And so that's why these people look like Maharajas in these pictures. And these people are only here because they want to be photographed. So the relationship between him and these people in the city is completely different to Simpson's. Next picture. And likewise, when he photographs a British soldier with his Afghan security detail, can you find the British soldier in this picture? Is this a picture of hierarchy? I'm going to have to point him out to you because it's quite hard to find it. It's actually there. His name is Major Charles Warburton. He was a very interesting character, had a long, glorious career on the Empire as a spy and intriguer and the rest of it. His mother was Afghan and his father was English. He spoke about 8 local languages. This is him, but look where he is. You would think this is a picture of maybe this guy. In actual fact, this is the most important man in the picture. But the Englishman is almost dropped in at the back, almost incidental, and this is unheard of in this time. But that's because John Burke just doesn't have that kind of comfortable position with the English. He knows they look down at him. He probably looked Irish. I think he could have been red hair, and I think he definitely sounded Irish. There's no reason why he wouldn't, because he spent all his formative years either in Ireland or under the wing of William Baker, who's an Irishman. So he probably spoke with an Irish accent. Now, something else. Do you know what panchromatic and orthochromatic is? Has anybody here been to any kind of photography schooling at all?
Color and black and white.
Say again?
Color and black and white.
You can't have panchromatic color film. Panchromatic film is the way modern black and white film works. And sorry, it sounds a bit geeky, but it's interesting. If you photograph a medium grey object, a medium red object, a medium blue object, sorry, medium green, a medium red, medium blue object in panchromatic film, it will all record as the same kind of grey. It just records its tonal value. So that's what modern film is meant to do. It works very differently. Now the film that these photographers are using is not panchromatic, it's orthochromatic. And so it only records on the red light. Only red light makes any impact on the negative. Blue light makes no impact. So in this picture there's probably a blue sky with white fluffy clouds. But blue records as white. It makes no impact on the negative at all. And the picture is entirely made from the red end of the spectrum. And these photographers knew that it did this. And so Afghans have a lot of red pigment in their skin. And so because that red light is there, it records the skin tone is very dark. So, you know, some of these guys, they look almost kind of African. The skin tone is so dark. Whereas this Englishman right there, he looks like he's lit from the inside. You know, he looks like a kind of angelic sort of light is pouring out from him. Because English skin on the whole doesn't have a lot of pigment measured out and such. And these photographers in this time knew that this is what this orthochromatic film did. And they employed this difference because they wanted to photograph this kind of gulf between wizened, blackened, tribal mountain men and lily-skinned, white, delicate, lily-skinned sons of the empire. And they wanted to show that gulf between these two, so that they were conscious that this film made that effect, and that these white men would appear rather almost waxy, really, with this using the red light. That's what orthochrome film is. And when I made the portraits, and John Berg taught me how to make the portraits, when I made the portraits, I copied this idea of a digital orthochrome. Because so what I did was I dumped all of the blue and the red and the green data from the file, and I only made the black and white conversions from the red data. And I wanted to use that idea of a photographic method of marking race more extreme than it is. Because when John Berg photographs Afghanistan, it's an Afghan city. Kabul is an Afghan city, mostly run by Afghans. Whereas what's true about the city now is it's run by internationals. And all the decision making takes place in the embassies and in the big NGOs. And in Hamid Karzai just gets told what to do all day, what day he should take the garbage out. And those are the kind of decisions that he makes. And that idea of using that racial difference is something that I imported into the group portraits, which I'm going to show you here. Now that's rather unpleasant and nasty, and unfortunately no one ever does that anywhere else nowadays. Travis, next picture please. What the hell is that doing now? Next picture please. Sharp, aren't you? This is the Norfolk project that I did, and I presented this project as an artistic partnership between me and John Berg. It's a partnership in every sense of the word, except for the fact that he's dead. But in every other way, a partnership. You know, I imported a whole load of ideas from photography into mine: how to shoot portraits, how to shoot panoramas, things I'd never done before. But also, I wanted the photography to be very much of what would Berg be photographing now if he were around? What would he find interesting if he turned his camera on? Next one. So I began the project after I'd done this teaching with these students with an 8-week stint in a couple of street workers, working with Fadi and relying on Fadi. And this is the city of Kabul, this is the centre of Kabul, and everything between me and the mountain has changed completely. But the mountain shape is the same, obviously. So the only place we could start was with mountain shape. So I began the first week or so with Fadi with something of a kind of photographic do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, just like a kind of limbering up exercise, where what we would do is we would deliberately find exactly where John Berg's photographs were. I didn't want the whole project to be re-photographic, and definitely not a really geeky re-photographic like Mark Klett's work in American West. It was very loosely re-photographic at all, but really much more, just something about, I felt it was romantically important to kind of put my footprints in his footprints, you know, to know a man more than what I'm in his shoes. And that idea of finding out exactly where he was on the hill was just a way of finding out something more about him. The first thing I found out is extremely strong and fit, but it killed me, camera. So some of the pictures, I don't think I used very many of them in the project, but it was important for me that the first week was spent actually finding out exactly where his photo locations were. Someone's got a message. Next picture. That's the city now. And what was important is the use of colour, because that photography that I did in 2001 was very much something that was enthralled to romantic painting and the ideas of romantic painting, particularly a lot of the anti-imperialist ideas in romantic painting, Claude Lorraine in particular. And so I copied all those devices with Claude Lorraine. That's the reason why I photograph ruins, because there are ruins in Claude Lorraine's paintings. It's the reason why I photograph shepherd boys, because Claude Lorraine paints shepherd boys. And the reason why I photograph that golden light is because that's the golden light that he uses when he makes those paintings. So all those devices I was working with, the reason why I make my prints this big is because that's the side of Claude Lorraine's paintings. And so I copied all those devices into the photography because I wanted to kind of quote from those paintings. But with this work, that wasn't appropriate. And so now, for the first time, I was working at a very different time of day, pre-dawn and very late post-sunset, where everything is wrapped in a blue light. And this blue light is very important, because I was trying to find a way to photograph my own sense of disappointment, trying to find a colour which reflected my sense of bitterness about what happens to the city where something like $1 trillion has now been spent in this country. $1 trillion. So this idea of recording the whole of the project in this wrapped around blue soft light was a way of trying to photograph that sadness and disappointment that I feel. Next picture. But very few of the pictures in the project were standing in the same place, but a great many of them were carrying on the same ideas. So this is John Burke's beautiful picture. This is a long line of camels coming down the hill. And the entire British Army was supported by camels. In fact, so many camels were abstracted from the north in India to supply the army that it held back economic development in India for 20 years. And this is the main entrance into Kandahar Air Base for these Pakistani jingle trucks that come up from Karachi. So everything that goes into the base, people and ammo go on planes, but everything else comes on trucks. And this is the sort of chief vulnerability of the American war effort, and also the chief absurdity of the American war effort, because now it's got to the stage where to get each one of these trucks up from Karachi, you have to pay $8,000 in bribes to not have them attacked, $8,000 in protection payments. But it turns out that 30% of that money goes to the Taliban, and is now the Taliban's greatest source of earnings, not attacking these trucks. And they never made that much money from narcotics anyway. So in actual fact, America's now maneuvered itself into a situation where it's actually paying for both sides of the war. If you thought that only in Catch-22, you're wrong. It's happening in Kandahar today. Next slide, please. And this is something of the kind of economic growth that there is in Norfolk. I even photographed these buses when they were somewhere else in 2008, scattered in the field, but now they're all being gathered together as a deliberate policy by Hamid Karzai to stop people photographing. About 2006, he got sick of photographers walking the street and photographing old tanks and old planes and wreckage and stuff like that, and he commanded that all of it be swept up and hidden away in the back of the garage or in various places in order to kind of deliberately make the city more photographically beautiful. And so all this stuff is kind of stashed away. I had to kind of set ladders that I made to get to. Next picture. And really, there are only two games in town as far as Afghans are concerned. One is working in security, and the other is construction. And there's a colossal construction around. When I was there in 2001, there was about 500,000 people. There's now about 3.5 million people in the same space. So the building boom is colossal. And these are day labourers who are warming themselves by burning plastic, just garbage and thing. And they're waiting to get jobs as day labourers on construction sites. Next picture. Some of these wonderful pairings that were put together were done by the designer and the publisher by women. I can't claim credit for this, but it's a really great pairing. The two is really great. This is the day there was an attack on the British encampment in the winter of 1881. The first time that the new Maxim machine guns were used. The British had 6 of the brand new Maxim machine guns that just mowed down these Afghan transport. And this is a picture of Afghan police being taken out onto the shooting range by US Marine trainers being taught to shoot at Camp Leatherneck in Edinburgh. Next picture, please. So that, if you look at that website, costofwar.org, you can see how much money has been spent on Afghanistan. This is thing is spinning round as this number goes up and up and up. And it's something like $1 trillion, which is quite hard to imagine. I think I read recently that the entire space shuttle program costs you $320 billion. And the Greek government are looking for 65 billion to bail out Greek government. So you can buy Greece for 65 billion. Thousands of millions of dollars has been spent in Afghanistan. And that is a colossal amount of money those things. And it's not the case that it has no impact. On the contrary, it has an incredible impact on the city. It's changed the city radically, but in a very bizarre way. It's created a completely hollow economy. And I see the economy in a Marxist way, a kind of layered economy. So the money that has passed in has moved into the very top of the economy, and there is no end of money being spent on police stations, helicopter forces, army barracks, torture centres, drug interdiction, intelligence agencies. That level of the state is incredibly well upholstered because the Americans are looking to put into power and give them the machinery of power to that very small minority of the country which they've chosen, Panjshiri Tajiks, and leave them in power long enough and not look embarrassing when they leave, and they want to get the hell out before the next election. So in order to do that, they need to be given the tools of power. So money is pouring into producing barracks and police stations and courts and torture centres. And then the centre of the economy, that place, the normal part of the economy that create jobs and houses and bridges and schools, is absolutely nothing is happening. The NGOs can't build stuff in the countryside because it's too insecure. Afghan, who in their right mind would build a factory in Afghanistan when the Taliban will be back in power in 2 years' time? So no one is building anything in that central part of the economy. But what you are getting is a huge amount of theft from contracts. So something like, I think in the library, this congressional committee of yours discovered that something like $38 billion has been completely lost out of contracts. $38 billion has been swindled from. And all of that money is being sucked out by Afghans who are pumping it into a Dubai property boom, which has now burst in the last year, and the rest of it is being spent on conspicuous consumption in Kabul. So Kabul is now a city full of private palaces. And the sons of warlords are driving that town centre in shiny new Humvees. So these private palaces are being built all over the city. And if you can build one in certain secure neighbourhoods, these big vulgar things, they call them Pakistani palaces, poppy palaces, if you can build these things with pillars and gold and mirror and horses on the roof and stuff, and if you can rent it out to an NGO as housing for staff or for an embassy staff, you can make $30,000 a month from these things. It's become a kind of huge industry in its own right. Great swathes of the city are now covered in these places. And the phrase that's being used to describe this now, because this money is being intertwined with narco money, is everyone's calling this narcotecture. And these are refugees from Nangarhar province who are fighting on the border with Pakistan, who've been allowed to set up temporary camp on the back of this traffic circle at the centre of the border behind these buildings. Next picture. There's a little guy here. He's made a tea shop. He can't afford any land, so he's actually dug the land on the hillside here to create enough flat land for him to build a tea shop. And above are posters for, I think it says, get a mobile phone and win a car, I think. And this is Burke's beautiful picture of the market centre in the centre, the bazaar in the centre of next one, please. The only other gig in town, apart from construction, is security work. So someone like Fardeen, for example, who has a job in United Nations, is supporting 20 people in his family. So if you can get a job working with the foreigners as a security guard, like this company, or a driver, or a cleaner, or something like that, cook, then that income can support the entire extended family. So inside Kabul, there is a huge support for the foreigners staying. Obviously, everyone's working for them. It's the only people to work for inside Kabul. But the joke is that Hamid Karzai is the mayor of Kabul because at the edge of the city is where his authority stops, dead stops. In fact, there's even a thing called the line. And the only time I ever saw Fardeen get nervous was when he said, "We're outside the line." Inside the city, there is support for the war effort, and the foreigners back outside the countryside. Next picture, please. Keep asking anybody if they know of the paintings of L.S. Lowry. Anybody? No. Then this means nothing to you. Next picture, please. Ellis Hiram was a kind of naive self-taught painter in the 1950s and 60s who photographed industrial scenes in northern England. Right? I need to download a picture and show you, don't I? But never mind. Next picture. This is more brief photographic work. So this is exactly the same location, split by 130 meters. When Burke photographed this bridge, it was next to a shrine just by the side of the river. This is the Kabul River. And it's now got a full-size mosque has been built on there in the 1920s. But the river is still the same, although it's now just flowing sewage and plastic bags. Next picture, please. And then sometimes the kind of pairings of the pictures were just more about sort of visual, it's like a visual joke really. So I mean, I very much like these little tiny figures of Buddha which adorn this beautiful Buddhist grave, stupa, it's a stupa, isn't it? And this is a museum of the Jihad against the Soviets. This chap in the centre is the leader of the Jihad against the Soviets in Herat. Now he's the governor of Herat, and he's used public money to build a big museum to tell everybody about how brave he was when he fought against the Soviets. And it's like these little kind of armed garden gnomes. These little kind of clay figurines. I think it's very interesting because you would have thought bearded men in caves with guns was a damaged brand, wouldn't you think? But obviously they haven't heard about it. Next picture, please. Again, some of these, Barry found a lot of these pairings, but it was things that I was shooting. I mean, it's kind of there, and the pairings are, I think, are the nicest thing, and the book is the best example of this. You get a copy of my book. The pairings in the book, I think, are really great. The kind of the dance between me and Burke is at its best in the book, I think, rather than at Bonnie's place where there's no room for it. This is the citadel in the centre of Kabul. It's actually still there, most of this. This gateway was still intact until quite recently. And this is an example of this kind of insane economic growth. It's a fortress on top of, it's actually a booster station for cell phones, but it's been built on top of rubble, so it will need to be destroyed when they rip down the rest of the building. But in the meantime, if you can make some profit out of a cell phone, then put this thing up there. It's surrounded by barbed wire, it's got a generator. I think it's got enough instant movies that you can probably stay there for 6 months. And cell phones is about the only money-making business in town. There are no landlines. Next picture, please. Just a visual similarity in the pictures, really. Now that everybody is flowing into the city, huge demand to build higher and higher and higher these favelas that stretch up the hillside, and now moving into areas that are active minefields left over from the war against the Soviets. So now they have to clear all the hillsides around them because children are playing in these mined areas and getting killed. And this is Berg's beautiful picture of these people called Kuchi people. They are like Afghan gypsies. They take their herds of goats and sheep and they go down into Pakistan in the summer and in the winter, and they come up into Afghanistan in the summer. Next picture, please. And I also spent 2 weeks embedded with the British and the Americans in Helmand, at Kandahar and at Camp Leatherneck and Camp Bastion in Kandahar province and Helmand province. So this is a beautiful high altitude picture of one of these British encampments, beautifully smart little tents all around. And this is that's actually my headquarters. This is one of the new Afghan army training bases outside of Kandahar Air Base. Next picture, please. So I presented the work as a sort of tale of two cities. The first city is this the bizarre, kind of twisted, bastard city, which is Kabul, which has been made by this bizarre economic forces that have twisted the city into bizarre shape. And it's only tenable by the continual re-injection of huge amounts of cash into the bottom. And the day the cash stops is the day the water declines. And then the other kind of bizarre city are the mega bases in the south. And those these huge military bases that are constructed absolutely typically dropped out in airplane in the middle of the Afghan wilderness. Camp Bastion, the only thing to say about it is it's really far away from anywhere at all, which is why Bastion's never been attacked. So these bases are completely alien, architecturally, economically, in every sense of the word, just plonked down in the middle of nowhere. But they are cities. Kandahar Airfield has 40,000 people that are camping. That's not like a normal city with like old people and children. That's 40,000 active fighting people live inside that airbase. And it's a 24-hour-a-day place of helicopters and rest of it. But it's also a city, so it's got a sewage problem, and it's got a little police station with a cell, and it's got a mail problem, and all those things that a city has. And Camp Bastion, which is the airfield run by the British, is the third biggest British airport in the world. It goes London Heathrow, London Gatwick, Camp Bastion. So these are kind of colossal bases where they are still laying tarmac. Don't listen to this crap about how the roads coming down in 2014. Just not true. They are building tarmac roads. When I was at Camp Leatherneck, I was with the sewage guy, and he said, "Oh yes, next year we're going to double the sewage site and sewage plant." And I said, "Why? You're going to have twice as much shit?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Why? You got twice as many soldiers, or is everyone going to the toilet twice as much?" And he went, "No, not twice as many soldiers. No, we're leaving. We're leaving." It's presented as this kind of tale of two cities, but in the centre I put the citizens. And these are the group portraits that John Burke shot and I shot. And this is the part of the project that was really mostly entwined between me and him. But I mean, I've memorised all of these pictures. There's only 200 of them. But all of them are in my room. And whenever we were doing these portraits, a deliberate attempt to find groups that kind of correlated with John Burke, and also then to arrange them in exactly the same way. So this is the part of the project which is most deliberately paired and twinned, I think. So this is a heliograph team. So the main way that the British could communicate information across the mountains without telegraph, they didn't have telegraph at that time, was using heliographs. So these are mirrors on tripods, and these on mountaintops they would flash the mirrors using the sun flashing off the mirrors. And that's the main way that messages would transfer between Kabul and back into Imperial India. And then during the night time, they would use these Howden stands. Beautiful picture. Great trousers. Next picture. This is the future of photojournalism. This is the British Army combat camera team. The British have pretty much given up on the idea of never allowing photographers on the front line. Why bother when you can train up a soldier in 2 weeks how to use a Nikon camera? So these are all soldiers with quite a lot of experience, and they've been taken out. They get 2 weeks training, and then they're sent back as combat camera teams. You can see this guy's got a video camera on his helmet. And now they compile the entire TV programs of these people's footage, and the TV stations are so cheap they will use this instead because it's free, rather than very expensively sending someone out there to film it. Not very good for your employment prospects. This is the sort of vast majority of the imagery that we're seeing from Afghanistan is now being produced by these combat camera teams. In fact, the Times newspapers in the UK have 2 full-time combat camera teams. They're just working for them. They don't have a freelance photographer or someone like me there. Next picture. So hopefully in this you can sort of see what this digital orthochrome does. You can see how dark it makes the skin. This man is a trainer from the German police force from Paderborn. He's an advisor and mentor. These boys are from a demining team. These are demining ones. So this is like with the sniffing desalination dogs that they use for sniffing dogs. And this is John Burke's picture of wealthy landowners in Kabul and their labourers with these Afghan spades. And I also imported this device of these carpets as well. So these are my carpets that I carry around to create a kind of sense of almost kind of theatre, a theatrical space where the picture would take place. Next picture, please. That's a good example. So deliberately using this kind of device of this space that is made by this fabric on the floor and reusing this stuff that I bought. This is Major Kamiari, who was the leader of the negotiations between the British and the Afghans with all of the Afghan leadership. Interesting that Kamiari chose to sit on the floor. He did that deliberately and caused a mass split. And this is the entire leadership of the Afghan Air Force with the colonel from the American Marines who was training and paying them. I like the skin tone. The skin tone's great. Next picture. Yes.
Did you pose them like that, or did they?
No, they walk around like that.
They actually had their first mission today.
Second?
They had their first mission today.
Yesterday, yes. Possibly, yes.
Yeah.
Possibly that. I deliberately look at these faces here. You think about a group portrait, no one shoots. Why does no one shoot group portraits anymore? The last time I can think of it, well, maybe the teachers can have, but the last really good portrait photographer I can think of is Neil Slaven, which is in the 70s, isn't it? If you know that. Using a 2024 Polaroid camera.
He was just here.
Was he? Great photographer, but no one shoots in group portraits anymore. You know, sociologically, why not? It's a great way to talk about sociology. No one uses group portraits as a format. And I think the reason for that is we've lost the knowledge how to do it, because we look at too many pictures of Little League. And in Little League, everyone's staring back at you. And it's like a wall, it's like a blockage of these faces looking back at you. And what Burke does is he kind of animates this whole thing. Look at these faces, down, up, sideways, across, in, out, this way, that way. And so the thing has got this kind of rhythmic thing that makes it move around. It gives it much more kind of poetry than a kind of line-up picture, like a soccer team picture or something. And so, I posed it, deliberately. I wanted to have exactly that. John Burke taught me everything I know. He's dead, actually. Next. So this beautiful picture of Warburton with his army guards, and this picture of American Marines with Afghan police that were training to shoot on the shooting range. If you Google Burke Norfolk YouTube, there's a video. There's like a little 17-minute video of me doing it, and in the video you can see me setting this up actually, and bossing them around. The rest of the video is mostly me swearing about it. Next. These are the last few pictures. These are called Nautch dancers. They were like courtesans, erotic dancers that would dance in the private apartments of the Emir of Afghanistan. It's not a public thing. But they were not Muslims, which is why Burke was allowed to photograph them. There's no pictures of any women in his entire project. These women were Hindus from India, and so they were allowed to be photographed by Burke. But they were sort of courtesans, not prostitutes, but and this is the Afghan women's national basketball team, basketball squad. This one's very good. Thanks, Mitchell. I think this is the final picture I've got for the quiz. This is the Emir of Afghanistan. And this is Major Louis-Pierre Napoleon Cavagnari, who became the British ambassador to Kabul. And he was chosen because he was a swine and a womanizer. And really his job was to be sent to Kabul and to wind up the Afghans so much that they would kill him. And then that was force the British to invade the country properly, rather than just set up the border, which was really and within 4 months of this picture being made, he was dead. A crowd burned down the British embassy and they cut his head off on a stake on his arm. And that was kind of what his job was, really. He was a real arrogant pig, and that's why they chose him. And that's Major Jenkins, he was also killed. And this is Sir William Patey, KCMG, British Ambassador to Afghanistan, with his political advisors and his Nepalese security guards. And it's a sort of hangover thing from the British Empire that the British Army still has entire regiments of Nepalese soldiers, are full members of the British Army. And it was part of the racial classifications after the Indian Mutiny that it was decided that certain races in India were no good for nothing, and certain races in India were martial and made good soldiers, Sikhs, Gurkhas in particular. And ever since then, Gurkhas have been part of the British Army. And in fact, the British Embassy, which is the biggest British embassy in the world, has a guard force of 500 Gurkha soldiers to protect the staff of the British Embassy. Next picture. The quiz. Ready? You're recording. Now, the guy that wrote that book about John Burke, Omar Khan, it's a really great book, and it was written about 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And when he was doing the research, he found John Burke's granddaughter, who was a 92-year-old lady living in England, and he did an interview with her. And as he was leaving, she said, "Oh, that's Grandpa John's picture." And it was on the wall in our house, which is why it's quite so tatty. So Omar Khan was going to come back and continue the interview, and the lady died about a week later, and he never got to ask her any questions about this picture. So when I say there's no picture of John Burke, there is a picture of John Burke, but we don't know who he is. picture, but we don't know which one he is. So what the competition is can you guess which one is John? Now, you can fling yourselves into this like wild animals with no clues at all. Or I can give you clues. You want clues?
How old was he?
Huh?
How old was he?
How old is he? When John Boat went to Afghanistan, he was 39, he was the same age as I was, wasn't I? So in this picture, he's about 46. Don't go for him, because that's his father-in-law.
Guy in the corner.
Oh, could you want to hear the rest of the clues, or is that Okay, well, we're all done. I'll tell you a couple of other things, which is that from newspaper reports, we know that he used to win a lot of horse races as a jockey on other people's horses. And jockeys are usually little fellas. So he's probably a little. So the guy in the corner is not a little fella. Is he?
Oh, he's closest to the camera.
Oh, is that you just choose because it's the first one? First one's in.
Closest to you.
Omar Khan says that it's this guy here because he's the biggest clown in the picture. He seems to be wearing a bear. Because he seems to be the king of the party. And you get some sense that John Burr, this is how he built his business. His house, this is his house, it was called Norfolk. It was in this resort town in the mountains above the Shah. And his house was a party. That's how he built his business. He knew these people from social events, and cricket club, and horse racing, and then he would photograph them, and that's how he made a business. Omar Khan says it's him because he's the kind of biggest fool in the picture. But Omar Khan's not a photographer, and I'm a photographer, and I've done group portraits. And when you shoot a group portrait, what you do is you sort out you on the left-hand side, and you on the right-hand side. And then what happens, if I then join the picture, if I go and stand in the middle, what happens is you will all make space for me. And you will fall out at the left-hand side, and you will fall out at the right-hand side. So I would never do that. I would never go to the centre myself. What I would do is I would identify a nice little gap somewhere, run around the back and fill in the gap. And I'll say one thing about this little Weasley here, is that he looks like he stood on 3 steps. She isn't, and they're almost the same size. So he's ever so tiny. Usually this divides upon male and female lines based upon next, which is this little boy here is John William, and is John Berg's illegitimate son. And he's the relative that this old lady was from. He's the father of the old lady at the time. So we know this is Berg's son, illegitimate son. And I would say, the way to do it, rather than your way, which is who's nearest to me, I would say, is there someone in this picture who has the same face as this boy? Is the father of this boy in this picture? Okay, well, no photographers, you look at pictures all day. Okay, so this guy here sitting there?
Yeah.
With the crossed swords?
Yeah.
Anyone else for him?
Yeah.
Because it's easiest to run
Put
together.
your hand up. Anyone for him? A bit, not much. So the guy to his right, what, him?
No, it's right.
This guy?
Yeah.
Oh, him, alright, yeah. Captain, what's that Johnny Depp character? That's name? Yeah, Jack Sparrow, yeah.
The guy you said in the corner over there. Not obviously.
This guy?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Anyone for him?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hang on, you put your hands up, I need to see whether you're male or female.
Another divide.
Uh-huh. Anyone for him?
Yeah.
He looks like the guy in the sketches. What do you think? Unfortunately, you know those sketches that I showed you? John Burke employed his own sketch drawer. It's a guy called Frederick Villiers that travelled with him and was paid by him to make sketches from his negatives, and then transferred sketches onto ships and get into magazines in England. So I think that's the reason why he looks quite slim. Because that's what I would do if you were working for me as my sketch drawer. I look quite handsome in sketches. So you can't really trust a sketch. But he does it's a little bit like him. And the man in the sketch has a full beard, and no one here has a full beard. But also this time, it was just about the time when those big full beards went out of fashion and replaced by moustaches. So that doesn't really help. Anybody go for this guy with a tear through his face? Really? Why not? You don't anything more about Italy than anyone else in the picture. Do you want to hear some more bad news? Well, this is Grandpa John's picture. There's a lot of Simon's pictures, but Simon isn't in Simon's pictures. They're Simon's pictures. This is John Burke's picture. John Burke could be behind the camera. He might not be in the picture at all, it's just John Burke's picture. So maybe he's not in the picture. Maybe he's taking the picture. Shall I tell you what, since you've all failed miserably, shall I tell you what the results of the poll are? Because I do this every time I do this reaction. I'm aggregating the results. And it usually splits on sort of male-female lines. But most of the blokes go for him. And most of the women go for him. And I think it's him. Because I think there's something about those eyes that could be the father of that boy. But that's just how. Anyway, it was $1,000 prize for Melbourne. All right, happy? That's everything I've got to show you. Thank you very much.
We got time for some questions.
Yeah.
It's hard to get permissions to go to places or to get people or you met with open arms.
Kabul is incredibly bureaucratic. And so it took me a week of applying for permission from the Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Defence, Ministry of Culture. It took me to do anything elevated. This thing yesterday showed you that they're very nervous about anything elevated.
Yeah.
So to get on any of the hillsides and looking down was really tricky. Without Fardeen, I never could have got the paperwork. And then Fardeen had to go and lodge the paperwork in every one of the 16 police districts. So otherwise we just got endlessly stopped by the policemen. The policemen are everywhere and they're bored and they see this thing and my camera is very visible to the tripod. Everyone can see me miles away, so they just come over to look around. So we were endlessly stopped until we got the paperwork. And it was very good. The military stuff was a different kettle of fish. You have to apply for an embed and everything like that.
How long does that take?
It took about 4 weeks of pleading and conniving to get around.
And did they have to go through all your work before?
There's two different ways. The British, both of them you sign a document about 35 pages long, which was called the Green Book. And with the Brits, they have a system where someone comes around with you and watches you everywhere, and then they go through everything that you shoot, but you can kind of ask to shoot anything you want. Whereas the Americans, you have to put in a list of every single picture you want to take. They sort of leave you alone to do what you want, but then they say, oh, but it doesn't matter because we looked inside your computer and there's a few phone calls.
Oh, wonderful.
So much more different level of security. So that the two different sort of styles of achieving the same thing. So it was our trouble. To be honest, I don't think as an artist I could have got into the military stuff at all. I did it on the back of some friends at the New York Times that wrote some vaguely plausible commissioned letters. I think they used a few pictures on their website to make it they didn't really, it wasn't really commissioned as such, it was really famous maybe. But Kabul is very easy to get to. You can fly direct from Frankfurt if you want to. But you're faced with two choices. You can either work as inside an armored car, inside armored compounds, and get out and take pictures, or you can go something like flying and take tests. I suppose the opposite end of my pictures is Benjamin Lowey's pictures from inside those tanks looking out of those 6 inches of bulletproof glass at least far away.
I wonder what you feel your relationship is to documentary work in this series of photographs, because you're obviously working with this scientific contrivance and staging with the rugs and the composing.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Sorry. So I wonder what you feel your relationship, or these photographs' relationship is to documents.
So are they documentary pictures because I'm also working with staging the portraits and everything? It doesn't really serve me any usefulness whatsoever to call myself a fine artist or a document photographer or a photojournalist or any of those things. It's It's not like I get paid more if I use one of the terms of business. So,
Is that all there is to
other-
consider?
well, I mean, other people seem to want to use those names, tags, pigeonholes. But, you know, I'm selling it. That's all I need. So I don't, you know, is it documentary? Yeah, I think so, pretty much. Is it a portrait of the city? Yeah, you're damn right it is. Is it a better portrait of the city than the garbage that comes out of journalism from Afghanistan, which I really doubt on, and I despise enormously? Then yeah, I think it's a downside there, because with all the work there's an attempt to, you know, I haven't really talked about this, but what I'm trying to do is puncture that surfaceness of what photography is. All photography and photographs, what a thing looks like. I don't get it down what it looks like. I want to try and talk about how was it made the way it is. I want to talk about the process that stands behind it. I want to talk about the history that made these things the way these are, the colour way these things are. How it looks is the least important thing as far as I'm concerned. So I'll do whatever it takes to kind of puncture through that skinniness of photography's immediacy, which is always the best thing about photography, but also the thing that hobbles it the most. You know, what I've done in this project is by using historical archives to push through to what stands behind it as such. And I've always been interested in that kind of layerness. You know, the first book that I did was called Chronotopia. Chronos is time and topos is place, and a chronotope is any place where you can see time's thickness lying on top of this historical strata of the city. Kabul is a great city for that. So that idea of kind of puncturing through that superficiality is what, you know, that's the tactic that's chosen to make this work. But, you know, this idea that you can portray Afghanistan more truly by lying in a ditch watching some guy go bang, 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 which is the only good you've seen in Afghanistan, ad infinitum. You know, Marshall McLuhan says, I don't know who first discovered water, but it certainly wasn't the fish. And I would say, if you want to understand what's happening in Afghanistan, sitting in a ditch whilst there's bullets flying over your head is probably the worst place to do it. It requires some kind of distance, some kind of standing back. And the embedding system, which the military loves so much, because it's so effective at neutralizing any kind of criticism about what they're doing. As something that has gobbled up all those photographers that always know I'm not bloody bad. And I really rather despise the photographers. So, you know, like this, that, okay. Is it effective? Is it interesting? Does it tell you something you don't know?
I wanted to ask you, when you were there, you had this idea with
Speak up a little bit.
you had this idea with work, and how was it for you if you, for example, had an idea of doing a picture that was similar from the one he had taken, the same point of view, but you had all these problems to arrive there, and you didn't really explain why you wanted to do that point of view.
No, I did.
Because you did?
Oh, yes.
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 So he explained all
I
the
went to
story.
Lecture Culture and I did a big presentation about who John Bird was and how I wanted to re-photograph the city the way he had photographed it. And I also had a promise that I will leave an entire set of the work in the National Archives in Kabul as well, which I've half done. And we also did an exhibition in Kabul of mine and Fardeen's work and John Burke's work and students from the workshop in the Bagabagor Gardens, it's restored Rural Gardens. And all the work has now gone and is lodged in the National Archives in Kabul. It won't be there in 2 years' time. The place will probably get burned down. But
You did a presentation for.
Ministry of Culture. But yeah, that's the only reason I could get all this documentation was because I'd said it was this project. But also on the street, if you look at that YouTube film, there's a bit of footage of me on the hill. There's always little boys. There's always little boys. But I'm showing them the laptop, and they're helping me with the laptop. We're on this hill trying to work out which of these hills in the distance is the correct viewpoint for this picture. So yeah. And Fardeen got it from Instagram. That was a great thing about Fardeen. Loved it. In fact, I once caught him. Some policeman said, "Can we have a little picture?" And he said, "Yeah, stand over there. You look over there. You look over there." Fardeen, you go and keep that picture.
That's great.
Anybody else? Yeah.
So when did you first take interest in this area of the project? Like you went in 2001, and what was the impetus behind that? And I mean, I know you sort of talked about it, but like, when did it all start?
The 2001 stuff.
What brought you there first?
Desperation, a feeling of like kind of very conscious of, prior to that I was a photojournalist, and very conscious of photojournalism's inarticulacy. I think photojournalism is good. It's a really great tool for telling very simple stories. It's a good guy, bad guy. This is nice, this is nice. But it is really incompetent for talking about anything that has any kind of layers. And I felt the subjects that interested me were the things that I then got interested in. And then I found out lots more about them, and all those things were quite complicated. And yet I was using this rather oafish tool to try and go out and talk about these things. And it was then that I really fell out of photojournalism. It doesn't seem, it's like trying to put on boxing gloves, trying to play Rachmaninoff or something. It was just banging away. But it's good, it's really good. It only does really simple things. That's its job. If you think of the text that sits next to photojournalism, its job is to offer all the information about an event. Yesterday at 3 o'clock in Tack Hampton with the couple, you wouldn't expect that article to be written in how many pence Hamilton, or as unpunctuated poetry in like E. Cummings style. You expect it to be written with complete capacity, complete transparency, so that you can take all this meaning and the pictures in magazines and in newspapers are exactly the same. They offer all of their meaning instantly. And it felt to me that the subjects I was dealing with, my feelings were conflicted and complicated. And I couldn't do it anymore with this rather clumsy tool. And that's when I started messing around with big cameras and shooting landscape photography and abstract photography, messing around with ideas and metaphors and all that kind of things. Just as simply as a sort of rather desperate response to the fact that I couldn't get this stuff out in the way that it came. So that's why I looked like landscape photography. And the way I got there was I was asked by the Royal Mail in the UK to shoot the pictures for a set of stamps. And they paid me £7 grand for shooting bridges in British Thames at night time. And so I had this money, and then the war started in Afghanistan, and I thought, well, if I go and I blow the whole lot, I'm just back where I was about 3 months ago. And what I was most worried about was getting robbed of the camera. So I was making a living shooting with the Hasselblad, doing portraits for newspapers and arts pages and magazines and stuff. And I thought, if I take that Hasselblad and I get it robbed by a 12-year-old with a Heliograph, then I won't be able to have a Hasselblad to go out and make enough money to buy another Hasselblad. So I took the 5.4 because I never used the 5.4. So if I lost it, it wouldn't make any difference. So that was the real reason. I didn't really have an idea about how I was going to shoot it or how it would make any sense until I got there. I had a big plan about where to go to shoot and pictures that were interested in me, big lists of all the places that had been bombed, all the places that were military barracks, all the places that were targets, things off the BBC that mentioned the names of places that had been attacked. But I didn't really have a sort of idea about how to control that.
So when you went, how different was your journey through Afghanistan then, as opposed to how you kind of roamed around this time?
Well, it's probably more dangerous now than it was then. In the kind of random, just walking past, getting involved in a car bomb type way. In 2001, it was much more that you were a very visible target to some people who couldn't tell you were walking around and might take you. And in 2001, that we might have not much hold on. It sounds like it's more dangerous, but I've always found that actually going into war zones, as soon as the fighting has stopped, is by far the safest moment, because there's a kind of shock moment. I went to Baghdad, when they pulled down the statue in Baghdad, about 7 days later I was in Baghdad. And people were kind of reeling, and it was kind of Wild West. And if you want to go to military defense, you climb over the wall, because that's what everyone else is doing. And they're stealing doors and roof tiles and stuff. And that's when you can take all these interesting pictures, when all the stuff is lying around. It was, as I was, towards the end of my trip, you could see things clamping down. That when you went to the palace that you went to yesterday, some of the soldiers outside the door, and they say, well, you can't come in. And then it becomes much more difficult. But there was this kind of wild thing. And also people were kind of on the back foot in terms of, they don't know what the hell's happened to them. And then this foreigner turns up, and they say, oh, well, can you come and explain what kind of bomb this was around my house? Because I need to know if it's got the uranium coated bullets or something like that. So people kind of wanted to show what they'd seen. Come and look at this, come and look what they've done. Which is great for photography. What you don't want is this thing where people go, I told 3 people what they've done, nothing happened. So the 4th one that comes, he's probably got $10,000 on the laptop beside him. they shot the guy outside, the English guy got shot outside the museum. And everyone was like, oh, why did they do that? Is that how it's going to go? Oh, that's awful. I remember I went to, somebody said to me in the hotel, oh, if you want to take pictures, they're digging up bodies from Saddam's mass graves in the cemetery. And it's out on the airport road that you want to watch it. It's a bit sketchy at night time because there's a gun market outside the road. And the people in the gun market don't get to see the photograph. So make sure you're not there after nightfall because it's a little bit sketchy now. So we went down to this place, and it's on the opposite side of the road to this huge prison. And someone said, oh yeah, you can go inside the prison. All the stuff in the prison you can go around the side. So I got to the prison, and there's these 3 American soldiers outside, so you can't come in anymore. We're like, why don't you let us in? You know, we want to see this. It's like Saddam's torture chamber. Surely you want this photograph. No, we were told not to let anybody in. We're going to turn it into one of our own prisons. And I was with the Silicon. Surely you won't move into Saddam's prisons. That looks terrible. That looks terrible. You know, surely you build your own prisons. You wouldn't move into here. You know, the way that's going to read in the population is an insane move PR-wise. And this guy said, no, we don't always do it in prison. So I went to the cemetery, did these pictures, and then we got the hell out because at nightfall we did the sketch. And that was great. That was the first time at this place. So yeah, I write it down, it's called Afghan War. And we were probably going to that was the first time I went to Afghan War.
Were you traveling with locals as well during that time?
And it's easy to find locals because, you know, they've had their houses bombed and they've had their jobs disappear. So if they speak English, they've got a car, they just stood outside the hotel in the morning. Excuse me, sir, you need a translator to the car. You need to slosh them, don't you? You need to slosh them up. I gave a taxi driver a job with $1,000. He waved it through the window.
I mean, were you not, there obviously is a level of risk involved in just trusting somebody you don't know at all in those scenarios.
Yeah, I'm not sure about you.
I don't trust me either.
Yes, yes, and you carry a lot of money around with you all the time as well, right? I remember staying in Afghanistan and we left all our shoes outside, and then when we sat down to eat, little boy came in with the shoes and said, these are special shoes that should go inside. And I had a little odor each on the shoe, and the odor each was removed, and there was $5,000 in the shoe. And you could see it in the shoe, and the boy brought the shoes inside. Maybe you should put these ones inside, because there's a lot of people with shoes.
Well, that's nice.
Other questions back here?
Somebody? Yes.
Speak up.
So they can see behind you.
I was wondering if, you said you were born in Nigeria, right?
Yeah.
I was just wondering if there was anything that happened to you throughout your life that made you interested in race, because it's never at all that you see, like tribals in your position that are actually interested in race.
Can you repeat the question?
I was born in Nigeria, and is there something that happened in my life that's made me interested in race? Because it's unusual to have white photographers interested in the idea of race. I think it's a really good question. It's I wasn't dropped on the head or anything like that. So, partly it's a kind of, you know, I feel pretty furious about the photography of someone like Peter Hugo. And I think there's a profound racism in that, and also the work by Richard Moss as well, I think. Richard Moss. And I think there's a kind of arrogant disdain about really recognizing that if you're a white man pointing a camera at Africans, there's a lot of others that are going before you. And you need to know about that. And you're not the first one to do that. And all of these kind of cracking metaphors about Joseph Conrad and stuff. Marcus Bleasdale's another one, I can't remember that. So I think you need to have some notion of history that's gone before. I think the fact that I was born in Nigeria means that I've always kind of thought about it. You know, shit, I could go get a Nigerian passport. Yeah, I mean, I just have a kind of soft spot for Africa, and I think you should, as a photographer, I think you should think about what Africa means when a white man points a camera at Africa. And I think certainly something like, you know, if you look at Marcus Bleasdale's photography, that book, 100 Years of Darkness, the Africans that he shows in that picture are shadows, fleeting shadows that whisper through these pictures. No one is named, no one is described. You know, when I think about Nigeria, I think of places like software programmers and merchant bankers and people in the oil business. dark shadows that move through these black and white, mostly out of focus in the foreground, quite offensive. Compared to someone like Fazl Sheikh, who photographs in Kenya, and he says, and this is Mr. Omar Khan, and this is his son Mohammed, and his little girl, and she's 7, and he's 4, and he's 93, and they lived in this village, and they were driven out of their village. I think it's a completely different attitude to what you photograph. Interestingly, Fazl Sheikh is not a white guy. So I think that idea of taking any camera into Africa, eventually, the first time I went to Africa as a photographer was Suriname, which is a place where you could go crazy with all of those crappy heart of darkness metaphors about the savagery of the African mind. That's it, because it was a place that had seen savagery, undoubtedly, but not because those people were Africans. That savagery was there because it was the same kind of thing that we saw in Western Europe in 1943. So we're not immune from that kind of stuff. So I think that it's not a product of anything. We left Africa when I was 3 when the Civil War started. We came out PDQ from about from war started, and I don't have any memories of the place. But I think it's just something that comes from my socialist background, but also growing up in a house that was full of little, African art pieces and memories of Africa and photographs of me as a war in Nigeria and stuff. But I think it's pretty kind of crucial. I think we're all done.
Simon, thank you. From the bottom of my heart.
Anyone wants to come to one of the rooms tomorrow, you're very welcome. And there's a few business cards here, but postcards. There's not as many postcards as there are people in this room. Easy.
I apologize to you deeply for this projection, which I have no explanation why it's not working properly. I want to say to the students that Simon is everything that I believe in as the crossover of all the operations of the lens arts. No titles, no documentary, no artist, no all the thing. Just an image maker who wants to make a difference and see the world as honestly as he can through his truth. And really drawing from everything that's important, from the history, from those who went before, to the politics, and all the issues that we so easily crop out of our pictures. He's trying to put back in. Thanks.